Sometimes they crank the bass. Oh, we're going to look at Daniel today in our Bible stories. We'll talk about Daniel himself. We may get to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego too, so we get two for today. Maybe. We'll see. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, I thank you so much for letting us come together and study your word and talk about things in it that may be new to us or surprising to us, or even things that are familiar to us but we see in a new way. I pray that this class would be a time for us to reflect on how we might live our lives more consistently for you each and every day in the midst of a world that is not where you are. It's not where you are reigning, ruling, and so often opposed to you in people's lives. And I pray, Lord, that we can be Daniels wherever we may be. In Jesus' name, amen. So this book is very special to me. In 2003, I was interning over at Fountain Square with Jim Savage, and Jim preached a sermon on Daniel, and my wife and I looked at each other and said, that's it. That's what we're going to name our son. So he's Daniel. We had not known at that point exactly what we were going to do. We knew his middle name was going to be Jay, after Jerry Jay. We offered Angela's dad to name Daniel after him, but he said, don't you dare saddle a kid with that name, because his first name is Clifford. He said, it's only a big red dog now. You cannot name it. So we were going to call him CJ. He said, no, don't do that. So Daniel was it. We weren't really sure. It was a lot easier to name him than it was to name Shelby. Man, we went back and forth on names for a long time with her. But we wanted Daniel to have the character of this character in the story. And I think he's very admirable. I just want to read the start of this. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylon and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, but he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom, and God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. I might have saddled my kid with a little too much to live up to. Maybe not. It's good to have an ideal, right? But let's talk about Daniel and his friends. Anything interesting or odd or of note stand out to you in this introduction to Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah?
God gave him favor for many things.
Yeah.
Favor for impressing other people, gifts, and being above all the other people. So it was God-given. They were blessed by him.
Yeah, their abilities, and this is something we see throughout the rest of the story, is that it's very clear that their benefits in their position is all from God. Everything is from God that they have. Their ability to impress others, their ability to interpret dreams, their ability to be healthy on... I have some friends. I have a friend in particular who's vegan, and I told her, your life would be so much happier if you just ate bacon. And she would come back to me, you'd be so much healthier if you didn't eat as much bacon. And we would go back and forth all the time over that, right? But I could probably use less bacon, that's for sure. But they were healthy and they were well favored and people liked them, and the guy who was overseeing them appreciated them and had affection for them, and that was all because of God. And the story makes that very, very clear. And in that sense, that's one of the reasons why we named Daniel Daniel, is because we wanted him to have God's favor in all things. Ultimately the point. Anything else stand out? John?
I think it's interesting that the phases that the Babylonians deported the people from Israel into Babylon was in the first deportation, which is part that Daniel was in, was where they just cleaned house with the best of the best. They took the people, who were educated, who had skills, who had talents, and Daniel fell into that group. And that's probably why he said, let's bring them in and examine what we have, and let's put them to good use, because that's why we brought them here, because they should have something useful to offer.
Yeah, it's likely that Daniel was of the house of David. The royal and noble families is kind of where they lump him here. But at any rate, whatever family he's from, he was one of the elite of the nation, and so they assumed that, that nobility thing, nobility likes nobility, I guess, and so they just assumed that they would have these skills, and they did, but beyond anything that the conquerors could have imagined. That's part of the story, though, that I think that we teach it to kids and kids understand it, but the more I think about it as an adult, when I sit down and slow down to read this story, I think longer and longer and more about this deportation, about the taking of these young men, in this case, and planting them in another culture, saying, we're going to teach you the language and the literature, and we're going to put you to service. And I kind of get it. They're hostages, right? They're being held hostage against good behavior from other Israelites, other citizens of the kingdom of Judah, that, hey, look, we've got your nobility, and we can do with them what we want. And then also, we're going to turn them into us. And it becomes this lesson, like we have this power to do it. But that's brutal. And it's an aspect of this that you don't dwell on with kids. You don't want to be like, well, I don't know, maybe it is your boogeyman story, right? Like, be careful, you're going to be taken captive by the Babylonians. Like we don't have that in our culture. We don't have to worry about that. But we do kind of do those sorts of morality tales with kids. But still, this has got to be rough. Yeah. Yeah. They're trying to strip them of their identity. And this it serves as propaganda to everybody else, but it's also just kind of this brutal torture. We have two dogs, and they're both rescue dogs. And when we got one of them, we're talking about changing his name. People were like, "If you adopted a kid, would you change their name?" I'm like, it's a dog. Plus, Rufus was very clearly a Rufus, and they had named him Clover. And Clover was not the right name for our dog. Rufus was. He was very clearly a Rufus. But that changing of names, somebody got really sensitive about that when we were looking for, because we had a list of things that we liked. But let's talk about the names. And I do think it's very important. This, again, we go over it, but they took out some of the valuables from the temple and kept them. And this is Babylon saying, look, we conquered your holy place. This is not just taking people. This is taking your religion and saying we're superior to your military and your nation and your king and your nobility. But Daniel's parents loved him enough and had enough hope for him that they gave him the name Daniel. And Daniel means God is my judge. How appropriate is that name in the end of this book? Because we know the rest of the story. We know some of the other things Daniel went through. Did he worry about the judgment of other people? No. When they said you got to pray to the king or else, did he pray to the king? No. Because the king wasn't his judge. The other people weren't his judge. The advisors to the king weren't his judge. God was his judge. And I think that name is very important to him in this book. They wanted to instill upon him this name that said that we have one God, it is the true God, and he is in charge. He may have been, this is supposition, but 13 or 14 in that young man category. Maybe a tween, probably not real little and probably not much older than that. But he goes to Babylon, and a lot of others were there. We're told the story of these other three guys. I do have this question, though. How come we remember Daniel as Daniel, but we don't remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? What? Is it just because it's easier to say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Or do you think there's a reason why? It is. Yeah, maybe it's the Belteshazzar is harder to say than. Or it could be that they want us to remember the name of Daniel, that God is his judge. But here's the other piece to this, that they are given Babylonian names. These names are all related to gods. Every one of these Babylonian names basically places these young men in service to one of the gods of Babylon. Just like the temple artifacts that are taken are being put in a storehouse and in service to Babylon. But these names all are related to Babylonian gods. But here's the interesting thing. They're a little off from Babylonian names that we have recorded that are similar to that. Some people have suggested that the names in here aren't actually their names, that the biblical authors couldn't bring themselves to write down their actual Babylonian names because they didn't want to write the exact names of these gods. I don't know if that's true or not, but it could just be the translation and transliteration problem that they're trying to do as best they can to write these in Hebrew and some Aramaic in Daniel. But it is an interesting suggestion that these names are a little off for Babylonian names. And I don't think there's much more importance to that than it's difficult to what's your name in another language? Well, I'm still Eric, right? No matter what. But in some places, that's not a name that people would recognize. And that could simply be it. But these names are definitely related to Babylonian gods. Did I hear something? So we'll go through this a little bit. We've got Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Jehovah is gracious. Who belongs to God? And Jehovah helps. Yahweh, God helps. That's their names. Their story is similar. They're all devoted to Yahweh, God, in some way. But then they're given these Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego Babylonian names. And Belshazzar, Shaduku, Meshaku, Abednego would be the more Babylonian version of these names that attribute to them Daniel to Bel, to Marduk, to Aku, and to Nebo. We actually know quite a bit about Babylonian mythology. But their story is fascinating to me because we just don't do this sort of thing anymore. And I know that in certain periods in history during feudalism that you would have children of nobility would be fostered by other nobles and they would go and live in other houses, and sometimes that would be done as a hostage situation. We get into antiquity, we have people kidnapped like this and taken far from their homes and re-educated, as it were. It just doesn't seem to happen anymore in the same way, and it astounds me. It astounds me what they might have gone through, what they might have suffered. Other thoughts? Yeah, and we do. I mean, we have certainly things in more recent history that could overlap with that. Slavery, certainly a stain. Other situations might be similar, equivalent, just as bad, worse, in fact. Yeah. Yeah. We talk a lot today about trauma. This would be traumatizing. And I'm not an expert. I worked for a little while, very short period, in a homeless shelter, and one of the things we did with all of the residents in that homeless shelter assessment, and you may have done it, you may have heard of it, but it's Adverse Childhood Experiences is what it stands for. And it's a really short questionnaire that asks about some things that happened in your childhood. One of them's like, did your parents or someone in your household ever spend time in prison or jail? And that gets you a mark. And I think if you honestly go through that short assessment, everybody's going to get a point or two. There's some things that will hit most people. But I think the average score amongst our homeless population in our shelter, and in the men's shelter at any rate, was about 6.5. As far as things that were happening to them as children. As far as these adverse experiences go. And I think about what sort of reactions would be ingrained later in life when your identity is stripped away, when you're kidnapped, taken away from your family. The potential for long-lasting traumatic damage on the other people in this story that aren't named what it could have been like for them. And yet something sustained Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. And I think that it's appropriate to label this traumatic. I don't know. It's quite possible, and I'm not going to try and psychoanalyze any of the stuff about Daniel later in the book, but it's possible that he experienced some of this post-traumatic reaction later in life. But even so, we see a whole lot of God guiding him through his life, and I think that's amazing to look at as well.
Total conversion, but an enlightening to, I really didn't do this. Their God was working all the time in the background.
Yeah. We may get there today, but the point being, right, that all along throughout this, that Yahweh God is working throughout the background. Nebuchadnezzar eventually recognizes that and says it. But yeah, I mean, these young men, and Daniel, like Joseph and like others in different stories, when he pushes back, when he fights back against these captors, it's done in a very gentle way, a very godly way. He does everything he can to keep his identity and to stay distinct and separate and apart from the rest of the Babylonian young men who are there, or other captives, maybe even from other nations, which is likely. It's likely that there were not just Israelite children, Judahite children, but there were young men from other countries that Babylon had captured, because they went in lots of directions with their wars. But he said, I'm gonna stay me, and I'm gonna stay true to me, and who I am is a child, a servant of God, who is my judge. Yeah. Yeah.
Even today, with young women mostly, although some young men, it's sad that evil, still the same type of evil still exists.
And we've seen that in a couple of other stories we've looked at even. But human trafficking does exist, and it's a dark blot on global society, really, the fact that we do that and feel the need for whatever purpose, sexual or otherwise, which is often the reason for that now. Again, this story is one that the more I dwell on the circumstances of it, and I say, I have no idea what it would have been like, but I try and imagine, because that's all I can do, right? My parents have been married for over 50 years. I was raised in the same home I was like one when you guys moved to that house until I was in college. They lived in the same house. All right, I had a life of stability. I went to church every Sunday, and I was always pretty well fed. I didn't have to worry about this kind of thing. I never even thought about it. And even when I read these stories, it was so far out of anything that I'd ever experienced that as a kid reading it, versus now, where I have a greater knowledge of the world and how it works and the horrors that lie in it, and I can sit and meditate on it, I don't like Daniel any less. He's in fact maybe an even better character to name my son after than what I thought. But this book and the rest of the Bible, many parts of it are things that should remind us that in our comfort, we have some privilege, that in our comfort, we live in a place that allows us this ability to feel safe, but a lot of people don't. And not all of them are in some other country. There's people in our nation that do not feel safe concerning their lives and their well-being or where their next meal comes from. And it's easy for us, I think, to read this in that childlike way and just say, well, okay, Daniel's a great guy. But when I read it as an adult, it reminds me of those horrors in a way that forces me to expand my empathy for the plight of people a little bit, and maybe, hopefully, to push me towards action to do something on behalf of someone who suffers like Daniel. Now, Daniel and his friends didn't suffer nearly as much as I can imagine they might have. Daniel ends up being pretty well honored, and it seems like he lives a pretty comfortable life throughout the story in a lot of ways, but he certainly faced a lot of challenges too. But it's worth thinking about for me.
Yes, a few years ago, I was working at an at-risk school, and we had these children in the afternoon classes that we just, whatever we did, they couldn't change their behavior. It was just constant chaos around them. And so one of the things we did during the summer is we took a class on trauma. And every single thing listed in trauma, these children had going on in their lives in this city.
Yeah. I took a continuing education course on trauma in the church that was fascinating. After that class was over, a guy I know actually wrote a book called Trauma Informed Evangelism. It's very recent. He's a Church of Christ guy. And he talks about how a lot of our evangelistic methods in the past have been trauma-inducing to people. And people who have already experienced trauma will be immediately turned away and turned off from our evangelistic attempts if we engage in those methods of traumatic evangelization. And so he asks us to be informed about that and think about alternative ways to share the gospel with people, because it doesn't seem like good news to them sometimes. Fascinating stuff. People in general, and the church in particular, we don't tend to understand trauma very well. And I think this is a story that makes us think about what that would be like to experience. Did I see another hand go up? I thought I saw that.
I don't think anybody understands trauma.
No.
I think it's the struggle that we all have. It's why we're strugglers, because trauma and pain and suffering is the question, and we don't have all the answers. We know that God is in control,
Yeah.
and we know that He's with us, but we don't know why we have to suffer, and why some people suffer the way they do. We don't have all those answers, but we do know that we have the narrative in Daniel that teaches us that God is in control. We have Jesus who said, pick up your cross and follow me, meaning even though you don't understand and you're going to have suffering, you're going to have trouble, carry that cross, and there'll be more to you than you can imagine there is, because I'm with you, and just follow me. And that's the message, but we don't understand it.
Yeah. Dad, you had your hand up. Sorry.
I look at the books of 1st, 2nd Peter, almost deeper than usual, and there's a lot of suffering in there. It's suffer as a Christian, we will be blessed later on. That's a promise. But it also sounds like it, actually it's not necessarily a bad thing for a Christian to suffer if you don't go out looking for it. But if you are suffering because of being a Christian, then for one thing, it brings you closer to Christ. If anyone's had trouble, we all have. At least we want to pray a little bit about. That's the least we want to do. And we think more and deeper and get closer to people that we love us, and that does include the church a lot of times. So if a church is, even a Christian society, make it much part of that. If it's attacked in any way in history, it seems like they've responded in a fairly positive spiritual manner, and including individuals. And since I'm talking, I think Daniel this is Grandpa talking now. That he's done all right. He's taller than I am, has 17 times more hair than I have. And
17. Very precise.
this weekend is driving a van for the University of Arizona, one of two vans for the youth going to the Grand Canyon, and he's wanting to walk to the bottom and back. I don't know.
Just because Dad did it, he wants to do that.
Unfortunately, the church has caused some of this trauma through the years, especially in recent years.
And one thing I'll draw from both of these comments is that sometimes people throw out the word trauma, and like a teenager whose parents are watching a TV show and she really doesn't want to watch the show they're watching, that is not trauma, right? I was so traumatized, but suffering is something, even if we don't cause the medical precise definition of trauma, and I do think that it's worth being precise about that, we do cause suffering for people sometimes. Tim.
You know, and I think that's thinking back on people I've known that have suffered
Yeah.
trauma. It's something that, unless you've been there, you can't understand. You know, sometimes the wounds are so deep and the mental damage is so much that the most we can do is to do what that says, to love them the way Jesus loved them, and to show them God the way, what's expected of us. You know, sometimes we expect to share the message and see change. And unfortunately, sometimes the trauma is so deep that, you know, I remember where we expected people, you share the gospel, we expected them to see this progression.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, you should be here by now. But sometimes trauma's so deep that they may only get to a childlike level. And I don't understand why, but I understand that sometimes the trauma is beyond my understanding. And as long as I do that, as long as I love them and show them Christ's love, it helps them continue to walk. Even when they stumble and fall, that's what we're here for, is to pick them back up, dust them off, just like we let our little kids when they did something or fell. It's like, yeah, not a good idea, but I love you, God loves you, let's move forward together. I think that's what we're here for. Sometimes, and I know I thought this, I wanted to fix people. I can't fix anybody. I can only do my best to be my best each day to become more like Jesus. And sometimes I just need to walk with them in the journey and their struggle.
Being a fixer usually ends up backfiring, doesn't it? Yeah. Did I see a hand in here? I thought up there.
I was just going to say that the definition of trauma has changed through the years. A lot of conditions haven't been diagnosed or defined until more recently, like ADHD or depression or a lot of those things. So we've added definition to it later on and applying it to the past.
Yeah, and I don't know that that's necessarily wrong. We don't have everything, you know, we don't have Daniel in front of us to sit here and diagnose anything that's happened to him or any of the other biblical characters, but at the same time, you know, these stories and the words and the history of this was written so that people could understand it then. And I think it's appropriate for us to say, well, what's our understanding now, and how does this overlap and apply? And can this inform our handling of people and situations? And I think it can with our current understanding. That's why I bring that into it. Let's jump forward so we get the other guys in here for a second to chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And he sent a bunch of people out and gave them direction that you have to come to the dedication of the statue he'd set up. And all the officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And a herald shouts out in verse 4, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of all these musical instruments going off, bow to the ground and worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace." All of that happens, but in verse 8 there's some tattletales. Some astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king, you issued a decree requiring all of this, and it states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace." Verse 12, "But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." So when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come back into the story, the names that they were given are being given again and processed by the lips of their opponents. And I think that's wise, because their story, other people talk about them, they use those names. But I kind of wonder if they were telling this story about themselves, they would say, "No, I'm not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah." But that's just my take on that. But King Nebuchadnezzar flies into a rage and orders that they be brought before him. In verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. I feel so sorry for those guys, always have. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god, son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. And Nebuchadnezzar offers praise to God, makes a decree that no one should speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Rack, Shack, and Benny, as VeggieTales calls them, get a promotion. One question: where's Daniel? It's trivial. I don't think it's important really to the story, but it sure seems like if they're being thrown in, that Daniel would have reacted the same way as those 3. So probably just maybe he was sent off somewhere to do something on behalf of the king, so he wasn't around when this happened. Who knows? But yeah, I mean, the book's called Daniel. Where's Daniel? Doesn't matter.
One of those questions we can ask
When we get to heaven, right? That's how my brain works, though. I ask stupid questions, and some questions are stupid, and trivial questions. I'll put it that way. He was on assignment. He was off somewhere. And that's what I suspect it was, and I suspect that had he been there, that they would have been calling out his name too for the same behavior of refusing to bow down. But the story is likened to several little vignettes within the book of we're not going to bow down to king or foreign god or king who sets himself up as a god. Instead, we're going to remain faithful to Yahweh, our God. And this strange angel in the furnace shows up. You know, this strange, he looks like one of the son of the gods, one of the B'nai Elohim. Same idea that we see in Job and other places, same phraseology. There's some Psalms and other places that talk about this, whether it's an angel or exactly what we want to categorize this figure as. Some have suggested that it's a pre-incarnate Christ. Do with that what you will. But the idea of this being came and saved them is an overlap that some people have made from the worst possible fate. Well, thoughts on that story? We're going to run out of time here before too long, but I told you I wanted to do it, so we had to read through it. Final thoughts on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Daniel? Oh, who's going? Doris.
Okay. To me, one of the most amazing things is verse 16 through 18.
Yeah.
Where they said, he's able to rescue us, but whether he does or not. So they knew that there was a chance they would not be
Yeah.
rescued. And that's just very powerful to me.
And that's the statement of the book, isn't it? And it's the point of all of it, that we will serve God. He can rescue us. Whether he chooses to or not, we will still serve God. I think that's a fitting place to end. Will we choose to serve God no matter what? He may choose to rescue us. He may choose to lead us through and see us through the worst times. And he often does. But sometimes it seems like he doesn't. And sometimes we're in the middle of it and we can't see the end. But we still follow God. So my son's up in the Grand Canyon today. You know, I hope that God keeps him safe and he doesn't fall off the edge. Because they have really cool signs of people falling off the edge and say, don't do that. But nevertheless, I hope in the midst of that he's careful and he follows God. I'll throw out one more interesting thing here. The lion's den that comes later is a very similar story. Anybody know how old Daniel was when that happened? Daniel was in his 80s during the lion's den incident, if you do the math. Some of you have a few years to go before you get there. I have a few years to go before you get there. Some of you were there. How would you like to be in a lion's den, Dad? Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, I am grateful for the story of Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, the names that their parents gave them and that honored you. I pray that with our lives that we would be able to stand up for you with the great faith that they displayed in their stories, individually and collectively, that we would find friends as good as those four, that we would support one another in the midst of difficult times, and that our faith would be strengthened because of those relationships. And I pray, Lord, that you would help see us through the difficult times in our own lives, and you would send us to be with others who are experiencing hardship, danger, trauma, whatever we can do to help them through it. May we be your ambassadors in those times. Bless us, Lord. Thank you for rescuing us, most of all from sin and death. In Jesus' name, amen.